Yeah, so thank you very much for joining. If this is your first leap out, or even if it's not, just a reminder, please can you keep your videos off and your microphones muted throughout the talk. If you have any questions, if they're clarification questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll kind of monitor that as the talk progresses and ask Brendan those questions if we kind of feel appropriate during the talk. But anything that's kind of more discursive, if you can keep that until the end, that'd be much appreciated. Just a reminder as well that the presentation is being recorded. So with that kind of housekeeping done, quickly introduce Brendan. He's currently a professor at the University of Vermont, based in the Rubenstein School and the Gund Institute. His work deals with a whole load of kind of environmental questions about valuation of ecosystem services, but also once you've got those values, how on earth do you try and change people's behavior? And it's kind of on that second topic that Brendan will be talking today about behavioral science and conservation. Can behavioral economics deliver on sustainability goals? So over to you, Brendan. And thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much for this talk.
Great. Well, I'm going to admit that I'm not good at multitasking. So there we go. Can you see that now? Can somebody give me a Ben?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much, Ben, and thanks to Michaela and Ben for helping organize this and organize me to get here in virtual space. And thanks to Leap and Ian Bateman, Brett Day, all the folks over there at Leap. I really enjoyed my last trip there. And unfortunately, can't be there in person this year, but maybe I'll get invited back and get to see you again. So can behavioral economics deliver on sustainability goals? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And it's kind of a large question to even think about answering. But it sounded really good when, I guess about 6 weeks ago, Ben said, can you please get me a title? And so I'm not going to really be able to answer that. We'll start to nip around the edges of that one. But I'm going to talk about a few of the spaces that I'm really interested in and some of the work that I've been a part of that nips at those edges of, human behavior and sustainability. So this talk might raise more questions than answers. And I left it kind of, in some ways, consciously superficial. Anything that I talk about, I'm happy to send the papers on or have discussions after the talk. But I wanted to kind of give an arc of the story of that interaction between kind of human behavior, behavioral economics, and sustainability. All right, one moment. Oh, looks like that's how we're going to. So I'm going to start off with a platitude. People are human. So oftentimes in economics, we talk about actors, we talk about agents, but we're really talking about people. Now, actors and agents are really good to try to model and to make assumptions about to see how systems might work or how they can be optimized. But the systems, the economic systems that we are interested in, that we deal with, all economic systems have people in them. So this person right here is actually my cousin. He's actually quite a successful professional. He's a very good father and husband. He was a phenomenal football player back in his day. And most of the time, he is a completely normal, well-functioning individual. But there's no way I could predict from rational behavior that he would wear such a mustache or put bananas on his head and then send me a picture of it at about 6 o'clock in the afternoon a couple of weeks ago. I think he's sober there too. So predictability of humans. So people are human. We do weird things all the time. We're bad at math and judging probability. Probably not a lot of you in the virtual rooms here, because if you're interested in economics, you've probably done a lot of math, but in general, we're bad at math and numbers confuse us. We have present bias. We care more about what's right here and now, regardless of the value of it compared to something in the future. So one of my favorite comedians, he has this line, hard work pays off in the future, laziness pays off now. That's my dog. He naps a lot. But oftentimes we take the lazy route because its payoff is here and now, ignoring the future payoff. So we have present bias. We're bad at prediction. So I feel a little guilty about this graph, but on the y-axis, we got minutes late to faculty meetings. This is not me. This is something that I occasionally do in faculty meetings. And these colors represent two of my colleagues, close colleagues that I love dearly, but they can't get to faculty meetings on time. And the data set is much longer than this. But I bring it up to show that regardless of how many times we interact, we make and actually do something, oftentimes we still have these predictable but irrational errors in our judgment. So we're bad at predicting. So you probably all know, you have a cousin, uncle, sister, brother, partner, student who is constantly late. And if every event of their life they're late for, it might be you, it's me for practice. I coach my kids hockey practice and I can never seem to predict how long it takes the kids to get ready for hockey. And that's been, I have, thousands of data points. So regardless of how much time I spend in that choice context, I still get it wrong. So we're slow to update. We're slow to update our operating system. So people are human. So we've got all of these things. We have loss aversion. We keep mental accounting. So we don't make things that could be fluid across domains. We don't let them be fluid. We have a lot of regret. We make decisions on regret, limited attention spans. Some of you right now might be checking your email and 4 minutes into this talk. I do that in my meetings. We operate by rules of thumb. Oftentimes we have this irrational overconfidence. So these are the a phenomenon that we're dealing with when we're thinking about how people make decisions. Here's platitude number 2. These humans that are fallible, are really good at impacting the Earth's ecosystems. So if you're interested in LEEP seminars, then you're interested in the Earth and the environment. And so this is why this is another platitude here. Here's a couple of pictures of ocean plastic pollution. We have done a tremendous job of putting plastic into oceans. Here's a satellite image from NASA. The top left is one of the Rondônia region in Brazil. We've lost 100,000 square kilometers of forest in this region in the Amazon. The one on the right, the white blob in the middle, it looks quite small, but that's 40 square kilometers of a mountaintop removed. The entire mountaintop has been removed. That's of a single mine in West Virginia here in the United States. We're really good at impacting our Earth's ecosystems and their species. This is the American bison, used to roam in a herd of a million at a herd. So millions and millions of these across the plains. I don't know how good your resolution is at home or how good this picture is, but this is a mountain of bison skulls. We've almost completely extirpated the bison from the American prairies in just a few short decades. Here's one man's impact on a species in Ireland. Look at that. Snake populations. Then this guy comes along, they're all gone. So humans are really good at impacting our ecosystems. And that's really what I'm interested in, and a lot of my colleagues there at LEEP. So I learned a lot about economics, economic approaches, et cetera, at my time in CSurge, which I was a postdoc where Ian and Brett Day used to be. And so I really look back on those times with just such warm feelings, because I learned so much in the pubs, in the cafes, in the lecture halls with those guys. And I say that because if there's any major egregious mistakes that I make during this talk, you can take them up with Ian and Brett. But this is where I'm really interested. I'm really interested in this interaction between the Earth's functioning ecosystems and state and humans. Now remember, these humans are bananas. They have bananas on their heads. They have all of these things going on that helps them make decisions, but also sometimes systematically biases them to making decisions that might not seem so good. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature has a set of this classification of conservation action. So this is that space in between human behavior, human action, and the functioning of our Earth's ecosystem. And so they have these 6 categories: land and water protection, land and water management, species management, education and awareness, law and policy, and then livelihood, economic, and other incentives. I put the 2 in red because those are the 2 that most specifically tie this idea of the human decision-making process to the impact on the Earth's ecosystems. So that's where I'm interested in, that kind of inner space between human decision-making, their behavior that stems from that human decision-making, and its impacts on the Earth. And even more particular in that, really interested in the big behaviors, the larger impact behaviors. So the behaviors with large impact and also large externalities. And so when I was crafting this talk, I was trying to come up with a shorthand so I didn't constantly say large impact and large externality behaviors. So I thought, oh, maybe significant impact, large externality behaviors, or LILES, large impact, large externality behaviors. But for the purposes of the next 20 minutes, I've settled on this one because I like the term line better. So I'm talking mainly about large impact, mucho externality behaviors. So these behaviors where we do something and it has immediate large impact, but then might also cause external costs, whether that be increasing greenhouse gas emissions, water pollution, displacement, both human and species, etc. So now I'm going to move to really talking about the humans with the bananas, the lines, and the Earth. And so in a project a few years ago that we started, we were really trying to look at these lines and trying to find the evidence base of what we know about human behavior with respect to these lines. So the lines that we came up with were land management, how we actually manage our forest, our farms, our cities, and our waterways, our seascapes, our marine habitats as well. Meat consumption. Meat consumption often bubbles up to the top as a individual behavior that can have drastic effects on ecology. Transportation, with its large external cost of greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, mining, etc. Family planning, waste production, so both how we consume and get rid of the consumer products that we buy, interact with, and the services that we use, and water and electricity. So these are our big, large impact, mucho externality behaviors. For those of you here, if anyone's here in the States listening and it's your lunchtime, you can pretty much leave after this slide. I've got a lot more, but I wanted to cheat ahead and give the conclusions. And for those of you in the UK, if it's time to get home and to do other things in life, here's the conclusions. With respect to our human behavior, these large impact behaviors and how they affect our ecosystems, it's pretty early days, but we're really learning a lot. So that's the first thing I'm going to get to. The second thing, a really quick conclusion, is that there's a lot we haven't tried. So if you're a PhD student, grad student, undergrad, and this kind of area interests you, it's a great place to be. Because there's a lot that we need to try and there's a lot that we can do. And that's also one of the things that fills me with optimism for where we stand with respect to sustainability goals right now, is that there is just so much space out there for efficiency improvements, for improving the way we do things already, for coming up with new ways to do things, and to utilize science to improve the efficiencies of those things. And the third one is there might be some key systemic places to intervene in this place of understanding the bananas and its outcome impact on the Earth. So when I say early days, that's early days, maybe. But so there's this great article by Neva Ashraf, Colin Kamara, and George Lowenstein that looks at Adam Smith as the behavioral economist. So Is it early days for behavioral economics? No. This paper does a great job showing that. Adam Smith, especially in his theory on moral sentiments, was very aware of the fact that people are overconfident in their ability, bad at predicting future outcomes, bad at learning or updating their operating system when they see outcomes that didn't follow their predictions. So, but it's early days when we're thinking about this behavioral science with respect to our sustainability goals. So I'm cherry picking just a couple of examples to fill this space to show what we're learning. So one of the very popular approaches has been trying to understand social norms and the effect social norming can have to change people's behaviors. So social norms are, people typically behave in line with the explicit or implied rules about how they should behave, or in line with how other people behave. So there's one, I'm going to show one quick example of that. Oh, there's a joke first. So social norms operates in so many dimensions of our lives, from our work, from our policies. Here we go, from our fashion. We've got the guy on the right saying, I don't care how young it makes you feel. You work here, you carry a briefcase. This might be an outdated mode or model of lawyers, but it's probably still the case in many parts of my country for sure. So social norming with respect to these large impact, these lines, here's one for water. So this is a study by Paul Ferraro and his group that looked at social comparisons and norming water use in Georgia. So this was during a very big summer drought in the state of Georgia in the United States. And they carried out a large scale experiment with about 12,000 people in each treatment arm, where they were trying to get people to follow the governor's guidelines of reducing water use in the summertime. So one treatment was just straight information. This is how you do it. This is why your water use is a problem. The second one was moral suasion. So this is the right thing to do. You should really be doing this. You should save water. And the third one was social comparison. So saying how much your neighbors use. Your neighbors only use this much water. And here's the outcome. So the outcome is that the reduction in water use across these three treatments greatly differs, not only in its initial impact, but in its longevity as well. So impacts could be detected from one single message 6 years later. So the initial impact of this was something like 180 million gallons of water reduced. And it turns out that if everybody had been in the social comparison group, you could get that reduction for something like 37 cents for 1,000 gallons of water reduction. So very, very cheap approach to getting water use reduced. Here's another one I like that's just thinking about availability and the salience of things. So this is Emma Garnett's work, where all they did was increase the number of vegetarian meals and selection in cafeterias. And so they did this both in an experimental approach, but also in an observational way. So they had 3 different colleges at Cambridge as their partners, and they doubled the amount of vegetarian meals and then just observed eating patterns. And then they also did an experimental arm of that. So all in all, I think they observed something like 94,000 meals. And a doubling of the vegetarian options led to a 15% decrease in meat sales. So especially red meat, this is one of those large impact mutual externality problems where we've got an impact on land use, but then an incredible amount of externalities from air pollution, greenhouse gases, but also the potential health cost of the populations in the future. So it's a big deal. The experiment really cost nothing. The largest effects were for people who were who in the past bought the least likely to buy vegetarian meals. So it's moving that, I don't mean to say bottom end, but it's moving those folks who are least vegetarian up the scale a little bit with no rebound effects. So in a lot of these studies, you see these rebound effects where, let's say I used less water this month, I used more next month. this was not the case here, which means that just because I had, let's say I'm typically a 2-meat meal a day person, and on day X, I had a vegetarian meal for lunch, it didn't mean that at that night I had 2 meat meals. So the rebound effect was not seen. I'm going to talk a little bit about my my latest PhD student, Hillary Byerly. She drove a lot of the research from our group in this area of behavioral economics and trying to understand people's behaviors. So, so that's her and her pet salmon. So one study that Hillary drove was looking at farmers and social norms in California's Central Valley. So California Central Valley is responsible for something like 13% of food production in the United States. $50 billion industry. So it's right here in the picture of California there, or the map, it's right in the center, hence Central Valley. And a lot of it looks like this stuff on the right, which is just monoculture. And so the work that we did was trying to understand, if you look at that picture on the right, there's not a lot of space there for biodiversity. There's not a lot of habitat refugia. There's not a lot of places for waste, whether they be pesticides or excess nutrients, to assimilate into the ecosystem, so wetland areas. And what we did was this was mainly a qualitative arm of a piece of work, but went out and surveyed 120 farms and asked them about their presence of some conservation interventions on the farm. So whether that be planting native grasses, wildflower strips, hedgerows, pollinator habitats, using constructed or small wetlands. So all of these things that improve the ecological conditions of the area, that include improve the biodiversity, habitat for biodiversity, and the potential uptake for waste assimilation in the valley. And again, just the high level result is that social influence here was very important as a predictor for farm owners to undertake some of these biodiversity or conservation agricultural approaches. So in this model, in this system, the farmers really trusted their peers, took that information on, and then acted on it on the landscape. And down on the bottom, I have a couple of other references there, because this corroborates similar impacts of trust and social norms in this Central Valley, similar research that has shown that. So we tried to do that same thing here in Vermont. So I live in Vermont, and a lot of it does look like that picture on the left, especially a couple of weeks ago. We were what we call peak foliage season. Those are sugar maples bursting, and they're just absolutely gorgeous. And a sugar maker has a sugar bush. So that's a big stand of sugar maple trees. And they tap those trees, not much like the way on the right anymore with buckets on the trees, but much more sophisticated vacuum tubing system. But we've been working with the Audubon Society, and that's kind of like the American version of the RSPB, to try to understand how to move sugar makers to adopt biodiversity friendly practices on their landscape. So if you look at the maple buckets on the right-hand side, those sugar maples, it's almost like an urban park there. You can see it's not messy. There's no underbrush. There's no dead woody debris. There's no standing snags. So there's not a lot of niches and habitats for biodiversity. That also means that it has effects on water regulation, soil carbon, invasive species, et cetera. And so we're trying to understand and study this whole gamut of how the management of the sugar bush impacts ecological conditions. But we wanted to say, we wanted to figure out if this norming thing worked here as well. So what are your peers doing? Were sugar makers susceptible to peer influence like we see in farmers in California, but also several studies in the central of the United States as well? And this is what we found. We found no peer effect. So if you look at the blue bar in the middle, that's the peer participation. Now the 95% confidence intervals overlap here, but the point estimates show that there's about a 6% fewer adoption, let's say, of our observed behavioral outcome from the peer group than the control group. Now, what was our behavioral outcome? It was requesting more information to join the bird-friendly Maple program. So you had the option. So we sent a mailer and a survey, and it was just it was a postcard survey, really simple to complete. And we had two behavioral steps. So one is, did they fill in the survey and send it back requesting more information? And then we did another one where when they requested information, we actually went out and followed up and did assessments on sugar bushes. And so it was kind of a two-stage behavioral process. But we can see that the peer participation had no impact on these sugar bush makers. And in fact, just at the point estimate, looks like it had a negative impact. It was about 6 months after we did this study. I was in a meeting, a conference, and there was a forester there. And the forester was talking about this survey they did with forest owners in New England. So that's where I live. That's where our sugar bushes are. He shows this graph, and it says it's only about 18% of these forest owners trust their neighboring forest owners. And it blew me away. And I thought, man, so in the Central Valley in California, farmers trust each other. They trust the information that can be shared across. Here, it seems that maybe forest owners don't really trust fellow forest owners. And therefore, maybe by making salient that your peers are doing this could have a negative impact on uptake rate. So the second conclusion is there's a lot we haven't tried. So this is going to be a pretty simple graph. This is once again something that Hillary drove of the process. So we did a systematic literature review where we looked across all the literature. You'll notice that one of the big line behaviors, electricity, is not here because that's the line that's probably had the most interest in terms of experimental approaches to trying to understand how to reduce that line behavior. So here's just the other 6 lines. They needed to be an experiment. They needed to look at one of our big line behaviors, and they needed to have a power so that they could report statistical inferences. And you don't have to, what I want you to see in this figure is white space. There's a lot of white space, which suggests that there are very few experimental approaches testing how behavioral change interventions can impact line behaviors. So I'll say that again. There are very few experimental cases where we tested behavioral interventions across these big line behaviors. So once again, that's good news for those of you doing your PhD and postdocs and wanting to make a career in this space. There's a lot of work to do. Again, this graph is from 2018. So Emma Garnett's work that I just mentioned on vegetarian options would fill the meat consumption column a little bit. But the color code in this graph is also telling. So the color code represents different types of interventions to try to change the behavior. So we have commitments, that's the red bar. So making people commit ahead of time to a certain behavior. Defaults, defaulting a behavior so that, you know, everybody when they get their license is going to be an organ donor is a default. Messenger, so who brings the message? Showbiz and marketing, they typically use the messenger effect. So all of your products for your hair or clothes or shoes or whatever are being carried by somebody that you might respect, somebody like David Beckham or Beyonce. So the colors represent how little we've done across these types of interventions in certain areas. So we can see that norms and meat consumption haven't been used because there's no green bars in the meat consumption experiment. We can see that making things, messenger effects haven't been used in transportation choices. So not only is there a lot of white space, but there's a lot of space to try different things within those lines. Don't strain your eyes. You're not supposed to read this, but I wanted to show more white space. This is another project that we're working on where we try to expand the idea of actors that we care about in this space of behavioral economics and sustainability. So we've got a whole suite of actors. So it's no longer just the person buying the hamburger at the Cambridge College, but it's somebody who's voting all the way down on the right-hand side, somebody who's voting for a meat tax, for example, to a policymaker who's pushing for more sustainable beef production, to a communicator or a campaigner or a lobbyist who's pushing a certain candidate because they have this stance towards meat taxes. So it's not just about the end consumer, it's about a whole bunch of actors along that chain. And the different intervention types as well. So things about motivating people versus changing the physical environment versus changing the economic environment. So this is just another matrix of how we can start to think about how these people with bananas on their heads impact the functioning of our Earth's ecosystems and its attendant biodiversity. I'm going to zoom in on this one just a little bit to give a more depth to that last graph. This is the Hudsonian godwit, and on the islands off the coast of Chile, these guys are in great decline. And one of the main reasons is because of plastic pollution. So they're eating a lot of plastic. But when we look at that whole chain of events, we can start to spread out from the godwits eating plastic over on the left-hand side of this arrow graph, all the way to banning the disposal of waste at sea on the right-hand side. So I'm going to zoom in on that. So oftentimes when we think about threats in biodiversity, conservation, and sustainability issues, we're thinking about the immediate impacts, what's happening right at the sharp edge. So that's on this left side of this threat chain. So if you just go back four red boxes, you can see visitors littering on the beach, residents burning plastic, nobody cleaning up the beach. So those are all reasons why the godwit has access to that plastic. If we look on the other end, we have these bigger drivers, and in between these social mechanisms. So the top blue box is lobbying to motivate politicians to support investments on taxes and regulations about plastics. So we go from the sharp end, all the way up to these more diffuse drivers. And just remember that all along this chain are people, are humans. And so the humans are the ones thinking about taxes. The humans are the ones lobbying against taxes. And all of those humans are making decisions, not typically fully rationally, but with all of these biases, idiosyncrasies, and heuristics that we use to get through our day. So here's the final one is there might be some key places to intervene. So policy. So policy is crafted by people. And we often, in the kind of the interface between behavioral economics or behavioral science and biodiversity conservation or ecological sustainability, we often don't think about the fact that those people are bananas as well. We think about this is the right thing to do. Here's a regulation. This is how we have to do it. But these policies are also implemented by people, and those people implement things in different ways, and they go about them in different ways. And then the policy affects some end user, and they're also a person. So if you think about it, you're probably getting tired of the banana analogy, but that's a lot of bananas to keep up. So that's a lot of places in the system that either can be intervened in or can go haywire because of the way we make decisions. So I'm going to give one final example about how this, how I see this thing kind of coming together. So China's Grain for Green program. This is a program that started in 1999, and at current it has reforested about 30 million hectares of the Chinese countryside. So the picture on the left is a denuded hillside or suite of hillsides in China, almost turning into badlands with erosion, et cetera. Now, the policy of Grain for Green was really trying to combat this erosion in the Chinese countryside. And the reason being is because it had huge externalities. So as we plant rice and grains on these slopes, we create erosion, and that causes problems in our waterways, causes flooding, decreases the hydraulic head behind hydrologic dams, and so therefore increases brownouts or electrical problems. And then also, this erosion caused the shutdown of international airports in China. So the airports in Beijing are shut down because dust storms are coming through. Closed roads because sandstorms have completely sanded under roads and limited transportation of goods and services. So there's huge economic problems with the deforestation and the denuding of hillsides across China. So the government, and depending on who you talk to and who you ask, but in my interactions and the groups that I work with in China, this policy was really brought about by both an economic argument and then the underpinning science of we need to think about vegetated hillscapes. And so the program was getting people throughout the country to plant trees on the hillsides. Now, those people were able to utilize the economic benefits of those trees in the future, but plant trees, and in the opportunity cost of losing your grain production, the government would provide grain. So you can see a hillscape on the right now where you've got all these cedar, and you can tell it's new and it's uniform stand, and now it is protecting that soil. So we worked in Sichuan, and this is how it gets implemented. So that's the policy and the implementation. So on the landscape in the center there, you have native forest. So that's the forest that's still around. Cropland is the thing that the government was trying to overcome. And the way to do it was by growing forest. Now, the implementation can be done with bamboo forest, eucalypt forest, cedar, Japanese cedar, mixed forest. Those are the main constituents. Those are the four kind of main transitions from cropland to these eucalypt, bamboo, Japanese cedar, or a mixed forest. And the implementation varied across China. It varied across the region. Here's the main findings. I'm skipping because I stole these slides from another talk that I give. And I start with main finding number 2, because main finding number 1 is that all of these things, I guess I can keep it on there. All of these transitions were bad news for biodiversity. If you look at the graph on your right, the green and yellow bars represent the cropland that exists there, or the native forest. Now, both of those have much higher levels of habitat specialists, biodiversity, abundance. We've measured this in many, many ways, but they are better for biodiversity than these grain for green forests. However, just planting more than one type of tree, so that's the purple bars, doubled the number of habitat specialists, doubled the abundance of rare species, and doubled the abundance of species writ large across our landscape. So just by moving from planting all eucalypts to eucalypts and cedar, planting bamboo to bamboo and cedar, these mixed forests have a huge impact on the biodiversity outcomes. So someone's decision to plant mixed forest has a huge impact on the ecological outcomes. And that decision was made by a person. We did take a little bit of an economic approach. And so we went out and we said, all right, well, maybe they're making these decisions because it's harder or it's more profitable to grow bamboo, et cetera. So on the A graph there, we looked at profitability, and we don't see a difference between eucalypt, bamboo, Japanese cedar, or mixed forest. On the B graph, we look at labor intensity. We thought maybe these mixed forests are just a lot more labor intensive. That's not the case either. This forestry only contributes about 5 to 13% of the household incomes in our region. And so the driver was something else. So then we went and we asked folks at about 300 households in our study region why they planted either their monoculture or their mixed forest. And about 12% of them said, because of my neighbors. So now we're going back to the Ferraro study and the lime of water use and thinking about massive transformation of a landscape. 12% of the farms did it because their neighbors did it. What does that mean? That means that because my neighbor planted a monoculture, or because my neighbor planted a mixed forest with its attendant biodiversity and ecological outcomes, I did the same. And so that's like planting Devon because your neighbor did. End whales, 30 million hectares over 20 years. And about 12 million of those, and about 3 to 4 million of those were done because my neighbor did it. So just to go back, these are early days, but we are learning a lot. And one of the things we know is that we're all bananas. There's a lot we haven't tried either. There's a lot of different places in the system that we can try, and there's a lot of different avenues that we haven't tried. And really stepping back and thinking away from just can this person eat this hamburger or should I give them a veggie burger? Thinking back to the systemic changes, which lots of people, probably several in this room, work on: taxes, regulation, education. All of those things can also be infiltrated or integrated with a kind of a better understanding of human behavior and decision making. That's all I have. So thank you very much. I'm happy to stick around for questions and hopefully be able to meet folks over at LEEP in person in the coming years.
That was ace. Thank you so much, Brendan. So yeah, we'll open up then for questions if that's all right with you. Feel free, kind of participants, to turn your videos on. If you have a question, either put it in the chat or just put your hand up and we'll take it from there. There's a question in the chat from Leah Tardieu. Hopefully I haven't done that too badly.
Oh, okay. So I should open the chat.
Oh, sorry. I was going to suggest that Leah asks the question themselves.
Okay, so the question is, what do you mean by family planning in the Lyme behavioral categories? And it's that having children. Yeah. And are there already any experiments on this, and how are they designed and everything? I'm curious. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you, Leah. I mean, that's kind of our shorthand for having children. So depending on the country that you look at, it's still somewhere between 40 and 50% of children were unplanned. Of new births, and some countries are up as high as 65%. And so what that means is that there's a lot more people on Earth, mouths and need for heating, meat, whatever it may be, simply because if we take a look at the rational actor model, they would rationally make a decision to have a child or not, but that's not what's happening. So these bananas that we all have are leading to, in some cases 50% of the births being unplanned, and so that's a really important thing to think about and to look at. And there's obviously the whole field of population studies have looked at this, but in terms of experimental approaches, what people have done is looked at different behavioral mechanisms to try to increase the uptake of contraception use, of family planning services, and a lot of these have been education. But one of the ones that was really neat was a randomized controlled trial in, oh my goodness, I'm not going to remember, I think Malawi, where when the woman and her husband went to one of these clinics and looked at family planning and contraception, the uptake was really low for contraception use and family planning techniques. Where when just the woman was invited to go, the uptake was really high, and they actually followed that out, not just to the utilization of contraception, or at least the collection of contraception, but they followed it up. And I can't remember, a year later or 18 months later, to look at pregnancy rates. And they find a really big impact of when the woman went by herself, she was less likely to have a child within the next 18 months than if she went with her husband. So that's just one example. This is Zimbabwe. Yes, that's right. Ashraf's, yep, thank you.
So I see Brendan as well. Brendan, not Brendan, sorry. Brett as well has a question. So Brett, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, Brendan.
Hey, Brett,
Thank you,
how
buddy.
are you?
Love that. Love the show. Bananas. I remember a poem you wrote about bananas when you were at Seasurge last time, but I won't bore everyone with that. So, Brendan, you know, we live in these peculiar times. Well, I don't know if they are peculiar, but ones in which lots of things that I thought were normal behaviour have suddenly changed. You know, I think looking at the President of the United States, he's had this sort of disruptor effect on things. I was just wondering if people started looking at this from the other direction. So all the things you've been talking about, these ideas of trying to encourage pro-environmental behaviour and maybe changing the way people behave from what they might normally want to do. And I guess I've got a question which is about, well, how stable a change is that? And if people started to think about, well, how easy it is for, let's call them disruptors, I don't know, people who aren't pro-environmental to use the same techniques in the opposite direction. So, you know, permanency, you know, what are we doing? And are we just leaving ourselves open for manipulation of the same sort of behavioral traits in humans to deliver outcomes which we don't want? So I've got to be careful how I'm phrasing that. Has anyone worked on that? It just strikes me as an interesting contrary.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think that I don't know about the permanence thing. Let me think about it the other way first. First, I think, you know, there's over $1 trillion now global business of advertising. And so I think, you know, the marketers and the advertisers are way ahead of the curve than, you know, like my lab group. And so that arm is about getting people to consume. And so in some way, it's the opposite of the pro-environmental behavior. It's like, how do we get people to think that the shirt they bought a month ago is now out of style? And so I think the economic incentive there is great. And that's maybe one of the reasons why we see, you know, kind of really unsustainable behavior, because there is this immediate potential profit motive of markets. The permanence thing is another really great question. And I think that I don't know the answer to that, but as Brett, you know, I'm just an optimist, probably an optimist without a lot of data. These disruptors, they do give us time and space to I would hope, time and space to think about maybe what's most important. So in a world where, you know, gloves and shoes are scarce in Shakespeare's time, maybe, the increased efficiency in production and cheap, you know, trying to get cheap products out, et cetera, really made a lot of sense. But in a world where, you know, I read just the other day that the average American bought 8 pairs of shoes last year. 8 pairs of shoes. And so maybe nowadays that's no longer economically efficient, but also perhaps not delivering utility that we really care about. So you can't wear through 8 pairs of shoes a year. And this is a long-winded non-answer to your really good question. But you know, during this global shutdown and pandemic, the number of pieces, articles that I've read, and in my own personal life, it's like, we've really slowed our lives down quite a lot, and we're very privileged. I still have a job, we've got food, et cetera. But it's also meant that we do less. We do more as a family. We have more social time. We care more about our individual health and our communal health. We care more about our community, and all of those things, family, community, health, those are the things that show in the kind of happiness world studies have carried the biggest bang for the buck. So for a unit of time put in, that's where we get our most fulfillment. Volunteering also always bubbles up to be up there as well. And so maybe there is this moment where we can start to realize that these things that deliver the big bang for the buck, those things are not they don't have to be very environmentally degrading. So spending time with your family, you know, local, you know, go into a local concert instead of flying to London to see Michael Jackson or something, right? So I don't know. But in my optimism, I would kind of hope that we are learning in some way. It might be slow and it might be stochastic, but I hope we're learning.
It's a lovely answer, Brendan.
In that case, we'll move on. Eleanor Warren Thomas has a question as well.
Hello, I'm Eleanor. I'm a research fellow at Bangor University. Thanks very much for an interesting talk. All the examples you gave of behavior change and understanding people's decision making are really inspiring. And they're obviously all very context specific and person focused to a particular place. I'm thinking about, at the moment, much larger scale land use change models. And I was wondering, and to forgive my ignorance if this is all over the place, but are there any examples yet of incorporating these kinds of behavioral aspects into larger scale types of modeling for land use change or other things yet? Or is that not yet something we can really do?
Yeah, so just a clarification, Eller, do you mean in respect to kind of systems or in like scholarly academic modeling approaches, or do you mean in terms of like the policy applied interface?
I'd be interested in either. I know a little bit about agent-based modeling and things like that, and the challenges of scaling that up to sort of countries or regional scale thinking. But yeah, any examples you come across would be really of interest.
Yeah, I'll have to, that's a great question. And I think we are seeing more of that. And the only papers that are popping off the top of my head right now come out of Steve Pulaski's lab at the University of Minnesota. I think they have a couple where they infuse some assumptions about behavioral, idiosyncratic behaviors into decisions that farmers and politicians make in Minnesota. And they've also moved those scales across the United States. So there are people thinking about that. I bet you there's people on this call that know more about that. I know that, at LEAP alone, they look at how people utilize, recreation and urban green spaces and make those kind of decisions. And my hunch is they scale them up to think about how those individual agents might change the kind of the policy and the landscape. But yeah, I'm sure I think it's coming. And I'm sure there are a few other ones that I'm just not thinking of right now.
Great, thank you.
Question from Ben Groom as well. Hopefully next up.
Oh, thanks for the talk, Brandon. Very, very interesting indeed. And you covered a lot of ground really, really clearly. So I have a couple of questions. First one was about methodology, really, and you noted that there are some questions which don't seem to be addressed that much in various literatures, and these tend to be the kind of big picture questions. And I just wanted to get your sense of how much that is sort of methodologically driven. I mean, you've just mentioned Pulaski's lab and other people, Ferrara has a lab, and this is all experimental. And, there's certain types of question which fit into that sort of framework. And they tend not, it's difficult, in fact, to sort of, in economics, to sort of take on these bigger questions like that. General equilibrium modeling has sort of fallen out of favor. Experimental modeling has not, it's the other way around. So I was just wondering whether, the methodology is driving the focus here. Is, we're all sort of drunks looking for our keys under the spotlight in a way.
That's very well put, Ben. Great question. I think, just off the cuff without really knowing the answer to this question, is that I think there are probably, if you can think about, even if just two-dimensional space where it's like the behaviors and the interventions, or the ways of knowing our scientific endeavors and the type of behaviors that we're trying to study. You could add another dimension, scale, to that, another dimension, realism. And so if you start to think about that matrix in even n-dimensional space, there are certainly places that will light up that will say, you can't study that here. You can't use that approach here because we just don't have the tools, or it doesn't make sense. But I think there are other places where there's that white space, that kind of like on those figures I showed, there's that white space And we haven't filled that space just because we haven't thought about it yet, or we haven't tried, or we haven't thought of a new way to collect that type of data. And so I think your answer is I mean, your question is right on. It's like, there are places that we're going to have to rely on optimization models, and we're not going to be able to do experiments. And there are lots of places where we just need to utilize, you know, tax and regulation, et cetera. But I think we need to, you know, for these big behaviors, I think we need to systematically look at those different dimensions. And perhaps there's space in there where it's like, oh my goodness, this one right here, we could really do a large scale experiment with policymakers on one end and with end users on the other, and come up with some really great insights. And I just haven't seen, and I'm happy to be wrong, I'd love to read the paper if it's out there, that mapping exercise that shows us, hey, you can't do anything here and you can try this stuff here.
So we've got 3 questions to go, and I think that's going to run us out of time. But so there's 2 on the chat, and there's one from Francisco. So maybe Francisco, if you could unmute and ask yours, and then we can kind of quickly summarize the 2 on the chat afterwards as well.
Yeah, hello. I'm Vasilis, using Francisco's computer. So my question is on the 12% you presented in the China reforestation study. And what I wanted to know is, did you capture at all any networking effects, perhaps, and I don't know, to track this 12% of landowners? How early on did they join the project and committed to reforesting their land? Was it like when the majority had already done it, or was it early on in the beginning with the early adopters? And that's my question.
So that's a good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. And so feel free to email me and I can look and we can plot the date of when people have joined the program. But oftentimes, you know, districts joined at the same time. And the difficult thing, there's even a more difficult thing than that we haven't been able to unpick, is that there might be networking effects, but there might also be real serious choice constraints as well. And so we haven't been able to get to if you think about millions of seedlings being delivered across the Chinese countryside, some locally and some driven quite a ways, there are places where only eucalypt showed up. There are places where only Japanese cedar showed up. So there's an even bigger problem than the one you bring up, and that makes our work, meaning we need to do more of it, is that there are places where they didn't even have the choice to think about Japanese cedar and eucalypt. They were just delivered one species, done, your whole area gets it, see you later. So it's a great question, but I think that it's even, you know, there's even bigger warts than that one. But we did not look at the peer network effects either.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I might just quickly summarize the 2 questions that we have in the chat just to speed it up so you get a little bit of time to kind of answer them, Brendan. So there's the suggestion that maybe perhaps the reason that people consume so much is rather because things are not made to last, and that they maybe were lasting longer. And then second is kind of wondering what's underlying those heterogeneity in results. So why you see one thing work in one context and it not work in potentially a similar but slightly different context. So
yeah.
Quick.
So totally on the kind of planned obsolescence or the poorly constructed consumption materials, et cetera. And we can think about that in terms of nutrition with our food as well. Food that's meant to just sate our immediate hunger, but actually not give us nutrition. So totally true. I think there are people working on trying to change that. And I think there's a consumer consciousness that's growing as well. In terms of the interventions working in some contexts and not in others, I think that's exactly what we should be expecting. I don't think we should expect wine makers in California to behave the way foresters or maple syrup folks work in Vermont, or people who plant rice in China. Remember, if you allow me the example of people with bananas on their heads, there's a lot of different contexts and a lot of different decision making going up in people's heads, and because of that, that affects the identities that we play out on the landscape. And so those identities might be triggered by different things, messaging versus norming, or taxes versus some kind of social message. So I think that's one thing we're learning, is that there are different places and different contexts and different types of people. So once again, marketing has figured this out. So when you get a pop-up on your screen, it's marketing to the type of person you are, not everybody in your region. And I think that's something that we need to learn about sustainability and economic policy design as well. It's like, people are triggered by different things, and we should utilize that to try to improve outcomes for society.
Cheers, Brendan. That was a really ace talk. So it now falls to me just to say thanks once again, Brendan. Thank you. That was brilliant.
Thank you all.
And second, hopefully you're now seeing the next talks. Yeah, I'll see. So thank you very much for coming along. Hope you enjoyed it, and we've got a few more talks as well so far booked in.